Remember, the Nobel Prize nomination was based on his essay Reflections on the Guillotine, not one of his novels. When talking about Camus, you must mention absurdism. You could even say he helped pioneer it. His books were based on absurdism, and his atheist moralism sort of eased it into place. Ironically, Albert Camus once himself said that the best example of absurd would be to die in an automobile accident. Whether it was his training in philosophy or a life of sickness and war, his works seem to seek out the meaning of life. His titles are short and to the point, as if that's the way life should be. In The Stranger, Camus's first novel, a character named Assault who feels no remorse or even grief is still talked about today in many psychology classrooms. Because absurdism relatively new, most people relate his novel to existentialism. Camus always felt that people didn't get it. Although he saw the story as absurd, most people saw it as a shallow, existentialist story. His book, The Plague, came a few years later. It was much longer and a better example of absurdism. I have been unable to find anyone to agree with me, but I believe Albert Camus made it longer to avoid the fate of The Stranger in confusing the absurdism with existentialism. We have talked about two novels, and I mentioned the essay Reflection on the Guillotine, but his journalism for the French resistance in a newspaper called Combat show his humanitarian labors. His journalism talents were at least equal to that of his essays and novels. One would have had to assume the Nobel Prize held at least some consideration of his talent. Another writing worth mentioning were the two publications of notebooks. They were edited by himself, and they were both a diary and notes. If you look hard enough, you will find clues to the ideas of his literary masterpieces. They are definitely worth reading. So what are Albert Camus's interests? I mentioned earlier that he was very active as a youth. His tuberculosis would alter that. Throughout his life, he was very popular with the ladies. Even through his second marriage, he had several mistresses, most of which were theater actresses. He liked to engage in intellectual and political conversation, usually over a drink or few. When his lungs forced him bedridden, he would read and make notes for novels. He was a man of honor if you could get past his adulterous activities. He really was a Humphrey Bogart with a heart. His photographs even favored Bogart. Most of all, he was a warm man searching for happiness in a world where so much work needed to be done. Toward the end, he was sure death was near for him, and he worked diligently on his masterpiece, only for the absurdity of life to come. Thank you.